Here in Lesson 10, we are going to be looking at the weight Paul places on maintaining unity in the church, specifically between Jew and Gentile. And the section that we'll be looking at is Colossians 3:11 through 17. Anyone who has read Paul's letters outside of Colossians knows that this is probably the biggest point that Paul drives in terms of practical everyday living. He's very concerned with it in Romans. He's very concerned with it in Ephesians, maintaining unity in the church between Jew and Gentile. What's very interesting is Paul's theology of this concept, if you want to call it that, is essentially something like this. Unity is something that you have by virtue of your faith in Christ. It is not something that is earned or worked toward, if that makes sense. It is something that you have by virtue of faith. What he encourages his readers to do is to maintain the unity that they have, not build toward a unity that they don't yet have. It's a very subtle difference, but it's really interesting to consider Paul's ideas regarding unity between Jew and Gentile when we look at the modern state of the church today. You will often hear a lot of talk in the church today about building toward unity, or how do we attain unity in the church? How do we achieve unity in the church? And for Paul, you have it. It's something that is already there by virtue of your faith. And that's not to say there aren't discrepancies here and there. Clearly, these churches that Paul is writing to were threatening to fragment along the lines of Jew and Gentile again because of what the Judaizers were teaching and saying to the Gentiles. But Paul doesn't come in and tell them to fabricate this kind of unity and hold on to it. He just reminds them of the unity that they have by virtue of their faith. And so everything he says stands on that bedrock. And it's sort of counterintuitive to a lot of the ideas that are floating around in the church today. And it's even more interesting when you realize that the first century was anything but a time of unification. I think by the time you get halfway through the book of Acts and you start reading these letters, you see that the church was anything but this great cohesive body of unity. In many ways, it was far more disunified than the churches we have today. Nevertheless, Paul taught that unity is something that is had by virtue of being in Christ, who has rendered null and void these former differences between Jew and Gentile. This is that classic section of text where he says there is now no distinction between Greek or Jew, Jew or Gentile, circumcised, uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave and free. It's a very well-known passage. But when quoting that passage, we want to keep it in the context of what he is saying here and the grander truth he's pointing toward, which is that, again, unity is not something that you have to go out and now build. It is something that you have by virtue of being in faith. Now maintain that. And when you're working through your differences as believers, whatever those may be, this is the bedrock on which you stand. You do so not trying to attain unity, but you do so for the sake of maintaining the unity that you already have by virtue of being in Christ. Subtle difference, but a key and very important difference that translates very well into the world of the church today.